Good evening. Welcome to group project number 2 presented by the Delta Group, members Terry Hervey, Clint Maddox, Josh Hamilton, and Keelan Logan. Tonight we're going to be looking at the idea of religious, science, and truth and how all of these things kind of tie into the philosophy and education. Specifically, what we're going to look at tonight is a little bit about scientific theories, biblical teachings of God, creation of the universe, evolution, etc. But specifically, we're going to show you some Catholic schools and public school examples and how those kind of play in to the education sector as we know it. So when we think about this, it's really important to look at this in the idea that religious science and then this search for truth, as we've been looking at through idealism and realism, all sort of come together when we talk about these ideas. And furthermore, they come together as we look at philosophies in education. So on this next slide, we're actually going to look at scientific theories versus biblical teachings of God. You can see at the bottom there that this is from sbc.net, and you have the actual website there where this came from. But when you're looking online, you can see that the creation of the universe, according to the Catholic Church, they teach a person that they must believe that the world and all things which are in it, both spiritual and material, have been produced by God from nothing. Specifically, how this is important is because when we look at the Catholic Church and how we look at idealism and this search for the truth, we can see that they ignore this scientific theory of evolution, and specifically we look to Psalms 33:6 and things that attribute God as being the ultimate creator of the universe. So all these material things in the world really become obsolete when we talk about God and scientific theory and how all of this comes together. So there's one example just to give us a brief overview. Now when we go to the next slide, we can see evolution. And we can see that in this path, the Catholic Church allows for the possibility, that's pretty key, that man's body has developed from previous biological forms under God's guidance. But specifically that you have to know that God created the soul. It's a matter of Catholic faith, and the human soul is specially created. It doesn't evolve. The soul is very different here. It's inherited from our parents, as our bodies are, and so the soul doesn't evolve as the Catholic Church teaches. And so when we talk about realism and when we talk about idealism, we can see that these go with the philosophies in education. We talk about scientific theories because in this quest for truth, we can see that our souls, as the Catholic Church would call it, were given by God, and they don't evolve like our mind does and can be manipulated by the material world. So it's important to talk about those concepts. Furthermore, we're now going to give you an example of Catholic school and public school. Religious realism is obviously more prominent in the Catholic schools than in public schools. I mean, that would be obvious. The simple fact that Catholic schools can make curriculum specialized roles to affect the lives of everyday students and show the needs for concerns regarding every individual according to religious realism. Whereas if we look at secular realism, it tends to the needs of the extremes of our society, almost seemingly ignoring the majority of our students in the middle. Public schools tend to the needs of the community more than the Catholic schools. As quoted from our textbook, you can see that secular realism is, quote, "The things children most need to know are those things that maintain their existence as individuals, family members, and as citizens." So religious realism can kind of tweak in the Catholic schools for the religious purpose, whereas in the public school sector, secular realism is going to look at the community standard. Moving on. Let's talk a little bit about the Pledge of Allegiance, because this is something that's been debated back and forth, especially the under God. I'm sure you're all aware of that. But the Pledge of Allegiance has been modified several times. Actually, the last time you see being in 1954. But when we look at the breakdown of the Pledge of Allegiance, we can see that this pledge to one nation under God. And when we think about this, we have to understand that religious realism is, in a sense, alive and well in our schools. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower, we have a quote on here that says, "The 50 individual states are united as a single republic under the divine providence of God." Why that's important is because most school systems have a mandatory pledge every morning. I know at our school, I'm sure at your schools that you guys teach in or have taught in before, Students stand up and pledge their allegiance to the United States, which is in their one nation under God. So you can definitely see that this religious realism idea is alive and well in the public school system. The next slide you're looking at is actually the First Baptist Dallas and some of their teachings. And you actually have a link there for a sermon at First Dallas Baptist about evolution if you want to look at that. But essentially, if you look at it in the sermon, Robert Jeffress discusses evolution in 2008. In the sermon, he will acknowledge that there's evidence that living things make slight changes to adapt to its environment, but he discounts any idea that major changes take place. Now, he'll acknowledge the fact that believers in creationism enter the argument believing that there is a God, while evolutionists argue believing that there is no God. Dr. Jeffress also defines our flaws of evolution. He believes to discount the theory as fact, and he supports teaching evolution in schools, but believes weakness should be shown in the theory, and creationism should also be taught. So there's kind of a look at how mainstream churches are viewing this, especially when we look at education. Now, on the next slide, we can talk about religious thinkers versus secular realist scientists. Now, although realists promote the importance of knowledge about the physical universe, the ends to which religious and secular realists put each knowledge, they differ. And here's the difference. Religious thinkers show that knowledge should lead to things beyond itself, such as God or truth. Thus, our goals should be gaining knowledge to reach said ultimate truth. Now, secular realists see knowledge about the physical world primarily in terms of its use, getting facts, improving technology, advancing progress. Therefore, they're continually advancing with an ultimate end or bound. The key difference is how we put such knowledge, or how we use such knowledge. So there's the two difference between religious thinkers and your secular realist. And so I think it's definitely important to note those two differences because they are definitely key. On the next slide, you can see the title is a prayer day examination. When we look at this, if you take out your personal bias, most school districts have allowed a prayer day before school as long as participants did so after school hours or in announcements. There's all kinds of different ways that schools have handled this idea of religion in schools, and it's such a huge debate. But so our best research that we found in our group is that most schools allow for this moment of silence. And so in that moment of silence, you can be quiet, you can pray, you can do this, that, or the other. But as mentioned earlier, religious realists stress the importance of knowledge and putting the knowledge of understanding, reaching this ultimate truth. Thus, it's not enough for just getting the facts for advancement's sake, or secular realists, but a need to seek something higher, which is like this divine force, this divine intervention. So there's kind of an analysis of this like little prayer moment from a religious realist that maybe we need to be seeking something more. Now let's do a little bit of an examination of creation and scientific approach in our public school systems. Good, another example. When we talk about secular realism, while many people recognize visual religious symbolism in schools, secular realism has had a huge effect on our educational system too. Standardized tests came about due to the impact of secular realism. The textbooks themselves are made for the average student, where critics would argue that gifted children are being squandered. Whether or not one believes this way of thinking, it's quite evident in the classroom. Evolution is the primary way of teaching in the public classroom, while schools are told to mention both methods without a personal bias. Significantly, there's a lot of references towards Darwinism. But that personal bias has to come out. The scientific approach also means to a specific question or hypothesis needing to be answered, and science turns a blind eye to a larger entity and only focuses on the components of this entity. So when we think about that, there's just a little bit more about how this is going on in public schools today. Now, the next slide you're actually looking at is an examination of creation and the scientific approach in our public schools, and this is from a religious realism. While many religious people engage in the scientific method of learning, such as their counterparts mentioned above, the distinguishing difference is how they go about it. One might use several religious examples with math, or devise a class lesson with religion and certain themes in a science class, but the point being there's a realist belief in molding children to be individuals with specific interests and fundamental values. That's really important. Now, while some religious groups, Except the highly popular theme of creation or evolution, it's still in the context of a higher power, that we've evolved from the higher power. That's the central theme here in religious realism. So obviously groups don't believe in the idea of evolution under the heading of religious realism, but they also believe in this creation of God. And so that's pretty important to note as well. So kind of to recap what we've looked at today, when you look at the idea of religious realism, we can go back and forth and we can talk about this, that, and the other. But what it comes down to is when you look at religious realism versus secular realism, it's really important to note in our public school systems today that religious realism is still alive and well. We can see it in the Pledge of Allegiance, we can see it in this moment of silence, and those things like that. And secular realism, when we're looking at Darwin and evolution, we're not going to discredit maybe the idea of this divine intervention, this divine force, but at the same time, realism all kind of goes back to that central focus. So hopefully that gives you a little overview and a little synopsis of the two, and hopefully you walked away from this learning specifically the difference between religious and secular, and maybe how it's coming about in the public school system today. So thank you.